Good morning. Yesterday I did a episode, I did a chapter, a sharing that I titled From There to Here, an attempt to chronicle my personal journey. And I mentioned Bodhidharma, Dhammo, Daruma in Japanese. In this sharing, and I had mentioned that incorrectly. I wanted to first of all make a correction. He was the 28th patriarch in the Indian Buddhist line, and yes, he was the first patriarch in Chan. And then I mentioned that when he went to China and he saw the conditions of the monks there in the Shaolin Temple, he encouraged them to begin practicing martial arts. And legend has it that this is where the Shaolin Kung Fu tradition started, with even today the monks devote hours to their Kung Fu practice. Yesterday I was a little stumped. Couldn't come up with Shaolin, but was made famous in that not so good Kung Fu, the Western TV show where they bypassed Bruce Lee to play the lead, which would have been much more authentic, and chose a white guy because American TV wasn't ready to have an Asian lead, apparently. But I shouldn't get anything wrong about Bodhidharma, about Dhammo, as I call him, his Chinese name, because he's one of my two bodyguards. He's one of the two Buddhas that I have had on either side of me, supporting me in my daily travails and travels through life. Bodhidharma, Dhammo on one side, and the Franciscan friar, Roger Bacon, on the other side. So my two Buddhas come from two different areas of the world. My friend from India and my friend from England. And having cleaned up, I hope, any misunderstanding there, any temporary mental block on my part, I wanted to address how I looked at, how I felt about yesterday's sharings. I was particularly interested in omissions. Did I gloss over things? Did I oversimplify? See, I tend to really think it through. And was there a difference between what I chose to share and my memory of these events and these times. And if there was a difference, was it conscious, unconscious, or even from my subconscious? Well, I have what they call eidetic memory. Now, eidetic memory is misunderstood as photographic memory, the ability to remember images, numbers, text is photographic memory. And I certainly don't have this ability. But eidetic memory applies to the ability to remember, for your memories to be like photographs, extra clear, even surreal photographs that you're able to retain, sometimes for minutes, in my case, for years. I can think about any event and I see a vivid, clear, meaningful photograph, as if that moment in time was captured, sorted, and stored. So talking about, particularly my time in the Renzai Zen temple in Kyoto, what I failed to share, what I chose not to share, was how completely human, not unsurprisingly, of course, how completely human were not only my fellow practitioners, novices, but also in the leadership, the hierarchy, the personal jealousies, the unavoidable, apparently, political tinges of life there. I think I chose to focus on how I fit in with this group of Japanese peoples. And I would be remiss to say that every time I heard them talk about me, I knew they were talking about me when I heard the word gaijin, foreigner. So any of you that are familiar with Japanese culture, you know what a close-knit, tight group they are. And there was this element in my time spent there, but I was able to ignore. There was a constant hierarchical structure. Even though our possessions, my possessions at that time was a pair of slippers, rubber slippers, my novice robes, which, by the way, took me quite a bit of time to get comfortable and as simple as they were, to learn how to tie and put on my outfit, my costume. Took me a while. I mentioned before that there's a disconnect between mind and body for me that I have to put effort to connect. I never have been too closely identified with my body. I'm familiar with it after 70 years, but still find a disconnect. Looking in a mirror to shave, for instance. At least to shave the part of my face that I don't let the hair grow. Took practice. Because a reversed image of the mirror. But I have grown comfortable with my image. Staring at myself on this camera has certainly helped. I recognize that guy. No problem. But this element of being an outsider, particularly relevant to this discussion about my time in the Rinzai Zen temple, didn't faze me. I was used to being different, used to being the other. I was born in California, and as a youngster I grew up in a blue-collar community. And my father had passed away, so being part of a single-parent family made me appreciate the differences. But I was raised in a Chicano, black area of town because that's the place my mom could afford to buy a house. So I was always in a minority. Then moved to Hawaii, where again I was in a minority. So it was no surprise my time spent in Japan, my time spent here in Taiwan, to be the other, the outside. Both in my experience in Japan and here in Taiwan is accepting my place. I'm truly an alien here in Taiwan and in Japan. And this is by their measurements, which is fine with me. But I started to question why I didn't choose to share not only my loneliness in the temple, not only my disconnect through language. There's a lot of time spent chanting, and they had some sutras in Sanskrit which were easier for me to pick up and utilize, but 80% was Japanese. So when it was chanting time, I just sat. There was also times of activity, we had seva, we had chores to do, which I found comforting. I like routine. I feel safe and protected, and I did feel safe and protected in this environment. We also practiced martial arts as part of our training. And my Roshi had told the abbot in the communication that he sent to them as I applied to be accepted was that he had me walking the Zen walk. So this was continued. And interestingly enough, I was left to my own devices. So my proficiency really didn't improve much. I was always just okay. Really couldn't connect body and mind efficiently enough. But no more training. Nobody continued my training in my pursuit of accomplishing the walk. So my time in the temple, even though I have these vivid captured photographic images of moments of my life there, that don't lend themselves too well to words. Best said about my experience there was that I was just as my purple bead, one amongst the many. And that was always okay. So what did I take away? Maybe that's more important. What did I take away from this experience? Well, I had autonomy within the confines of the structure of the life, of the daily life within. My disconnect through language, the disconnect that I looked very different from everyone else. But again, here's where Dhammo, Bodhidharma, Daruma offered his solace, because he was a Persian. They called him the blue-eyed Persian. He looked different both from all during his life, growing up in the Brahmin family in India. He was always different. Going to China, he was different. But ultimately he won them over. When he was first there, rumor has it, legend has it, that he was first accepted in the temple and then rejected for whatever reason, probably for being different, looking different, appearing different. He sat for 9 years in a cave. staring at the wall in silence. And you have to understand that this was made possible by the tradition of people retiring to the mountains. And it wouldn't be too far from a temple. And tradition was that food and water was provided to these people by the temples. And their requirements were few, but they certainly needed water and sustenance, food. So there is this tradition. Unfortunately today, unless you choose to cloister in some particular order, nobody will support you during your pursuit. Now, this is particularly meaningful when you pass from progressive to permanent awakening. When you awaken, my analogy was always as if I was a newborn, because that's indeed how I felt. Placed on a cold, dirty, hard sidewalk, naked to the world. So, not a pleasant condition, not a pleasant state of affairs. And I've mentioned that each year post-permanent awakening, each year, each chronological year can be seen as 5 years. So after a year, I was 5. And it was after a year when I started becoming comfortable with what had happened to me, started being able to understand. So, as a 5-year-old, and I shared what happened with people around me in my trusted inner circle. It was between 5 and 10, the second year after the awakening, that spiritual ego crept in. I started finding myself thinking that I was superior in some way, even though it was never on a conscious level. But the fact that I was peering down and saw myself as special with some relevant events to sharing my insights. And as anyone will tell you, this is the most dangerous time in your spiritual evolution. This spiritual ego is more elusive, more resistant than dropping your lesser ego, a necessary process of surrendering and beginning to remember what you had forgotten. And a lot of people get stuck here, but it probably took me 2 more years. So now it's 4 chronological years since the event, which was a 20-year-old man. And at 20, at this age, I began to let go. I began to recognize the spiritual ego for what it was: illusory, delusionary and needed to abolish, needed to rid myself of this sense, which included judgment. And interestingly enough, it included questions, which leads me today to the title of today's sharing. This leads me this morning. When I first got here, I'd been here for a while. I had my first university position, and I met a fellow teacher who I spent a lot of time with. And her English wasn't really very good. Wasn't good at all, actually. And I was full of whys. And so by this time, I'd been in Taiwan for close to 3 years. And I was full of whys and trying to understand this culture that was so different around me. I had a lot of questions saved up. And I used to bombard her with questions because I was a man full of questions. And I remember so well when she was just fed up and almost kind of yelled at me. No, why? Okay. And then I understood the cultural bias that I was lugging around, this propensity to always be questioning. And my life had been a series of questioning, looking for validity, looking for substance, examining systems, evaluating systems. And my outer dialogue reflected my inner dialogue. I'm truly one of those people, what you see is what you get. So at this point, those words stuck with me. I have an eidetic memory, a photograph of this woman yelling at me. And it wasn't shortly thereafter that I stopped questioning, I stopped verbalizing. Internally, I learned to keep it within my own confines because the society I was in was more accepting of the conditions they found themselves in rather than questioning. And this was reflected by my students. They didn't have questions. I would ask meaninglessly if there's any questions. Just as when I taught Western students before I came to Taiwan. And they were always full of questions. And the system here not only didn't value questions, but trained them to keep any questions as part of their inner dialogue, if indeed it existed at all. The system of teacher on high talking down to the students, lecturing the students where they took notes, regurgitate the teacher's words back on the test, only to pass if their memory was good enough, and go on to the next. But very little of what they learned seemed to sink in. It was quickly forgotten once the test was satisfactory. quickly forgotten as they go on to the next experience of listening. Quite amazing memories. That's one thing. The positive thing, if I look for a positive thing of their teaching methodology, from my standpoint, was that incredible, almost photographic memories, in the sense that photographic memories means to see text, numbers, figures, and spit them out, retain them. But there was a disconnect between this photographic memory. Might be useful for playing cards, a blackjack, memorizing, counting cards. It might be good for that. But it seemed like a giant waste of time to me. But this lack of questioning, this was an invaluable lesson to me when I was to find my Chan, my Chinese Zen teacher. Even though given opportunities to ask the master face to face questions, I never had one. I never asked. And he would go through the formality of asking me, but every time I replied in the negative, I was rewarded with a smile. He knew I got it. That the words couldn't convey the teachings. They only pointed the way, much as the Master is here to simply point the way. Simply walk us to the precipice, to the edge, in silence. But I remember him asking me to jump. And whether he did, as this was in a meditative environment. But the point was, I'd already faced and abolished my fears and trusted and leaped, and I've never regretted